The scent of petrichor, thick and earthy, preceded the rain. Cal Dennison inhaled deeply, tasting the coming monsoon on the dry desert air. He timed his chores to the rhythm of the approaching storm for 15 years, a habit honed by necessity and a stubborn need for control. First, the livestock. He checked the water troughs, already slick with condensation, ensuring the solar pump had topped them off. The cattle barely glanced up from their grazing, accustomed to his presence and the predictable pattern of his days. They needed this rain. The whole valley did. The ranch, bar none, wasn't much to look at. A single-story ranch house built from sun-baked adobe, a barn smelling of hay and dust, a corral and sprawling acreage of scrub and rock that bled into the vast, unforgiving landscape of southern New Mexico. It was isolation he'd sought, anonymity, and for a long time he'd found it. He made a final sweep of the perimeter, checking the fences, his hand automatically going to the small of his back, where, even after all these years, the muscle memory of a holster remained. He wasn't armed. He hadn't been for years, but the phantom weight was comforting. The first fat drops splattered on the dusty ground, raising tiny plumes of grey. Cal turned toward the house, intending to secure the few remaining shutters. Near the dry wash the arroyo that snaked through the eastern edge of the property, something was wrong. The rain was coming down harder now, distorting the ground, but not enough to obscure what he was seeing. Tracks, not animal tracks, human tracks, barefoot, it appeared, large, deeply impressed prints in the mud, moving towards the house. Cal squatted, ignoring the immediate chill of the downpour. These weren't the tracks of a hiker or a lost soul. They were deliberate. The gait was wide, almost a loping run. He traced one, with a calloused finger, too large for a woman, too precise for a man simply fleeing something, and there were too many toes. He counted again, slowly, meticulously. 6. A jolt went through him, cold and sharp. Not a physical chill, but something deeper, primal. He hadn't felt this sensation in years, not since the sand, the heat, the faces. He pushed the images down. They were always lurking, waiting for a trigger. He stood, his gaze sweeping the surrounding landscape. The rain was intensifying, blurring the sagebrush and mesquite. He scanned for any sign of movement, but the arroyo was empty, the tracks the only evidence of a presence. Tiberius, he bellowed. His ancient, one-eyed German shepherd lumbered out of the barn, shaking water from his thick coat. Tiberius, a veteran of Cal's former life, a relic of a time he tried desperately to forget. The dog's remaining eye, milky with age, focused on Cal, then followed his gaze to the tracks. "What do you make of those, boy?" Cal asked, already knowing the answer. Tiberius sniffed the air, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but it lacked conviction. The dog was old, his senses dulled. He looked at the tracks, then back at Cal, as if to say, just some drifter, probably. "Drifters don't have 6 toes, Tiberius," Cal muttered. He spent the next hour documenting the tracks, photographs, measurements, plaster casts. He went through the motions mechanically, a skill honed during years of training. The details screamed at him with a nagging familiarity. The width of the stride, the depth of the impression, the peculiar toe arrangement. It wasn't the anatomy of any human he'd ever encountered. He remembered Sergeant Miller, a man whose patience had worn thin under the relentless Afghan sun, lecturing him on tracking. "The ground always tells a story, Dennison," Miller had said, his voice gravelly. "You just need to know how to read it." Cal had been a natural, a prodigy, some had called him. He'd been able to read the faintest disturbances in the earth, to discern the number of people in a group, their direction of travel, even their emotional state. He'd used that skill to track insurgents, to locate hidden aides, to save lives, and to take them The memory brought a tightening in his chest. He forced it back down, focusing on the present. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said aloud, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. He knew it was a lie. These weren't the tracks of children. Tiberius nudged his hand, whining softly. The dog sensed his unease. "It is nothing, boy," Cal said, forcing a reassuring tone. "Just an anomaly." He'd walled himself off from the outside world. He'd built this life, this carefully constructed normalcy, brick by brick. A small ranch, a few head of cattle, the quiet companionship of an old dog. It wasn't happiness. Not exactly. It was containment, a way to contain the ghosts. He'd chosen this place specifically for its remoteness, its unforgiving terrain. He wanted to be unfindable. Yet, these tracks, they felt like a deliberate intrusion, a violation. He showed the photographs to Tiberius, pointing to the 6 toed prints. "See that, boy, 6. Humans don't have 6 toes." Tiberius yawned, his pink tongue lolling out. He didn't seem impressed. "You're no help at all," Cal said, a wry smile tugging at his lips, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He hadn't told anyone about the tracks. He didn't want to. The nearest town, Redemption, was 20 miles away, and Sheriff Brody was. Well, Brody was a good man, but he wouldn't understand. He'd see a prank, a misunderstanding, maybe a homeless man with a congenital defect. He wouldn't see the cold dread that was creeping into Cal's bones. Besides, Cal hadn't spoken to anyone about anything for a long time. He preferred it that way. The less people knew, the better. He walked back toward the house, the rain drumming against the roof now, a relentless, insistent rhythm. The storm was mirroring the turbulence inside him. He reviewed the security system by motion sensors. Cameras positioned around the perimeter. He'd installed it years ago, more out of habit than genuine fear. He'd convinced himself it was for protection against thieves, against coyotes. But now, he ran a diagnostic, double-checking the battery backups, the signal strength. Everything was nominal. Still, he felt exposed, vulnerable, like he was being watched. As darkness descended, he found himself pacing the living room, his hand instinctively reaching for the empty space on his hip. Tiberius lay at his feet, but even the dog's presence offered little comfort. Cal couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. He kept replaying the images of the tracks in his mind, trying to rationalize them, to find a logical explanation. But the more he thought about it, the more unsettling they became. He remembered a lecture from a Navajo tracker he'd met during a brief stint with the Border Patrol. Old Man Yazzie had spoken of skinwalkers, shapeshifters who could assume the form of animals, or even humans, with irregularities. Things weren't quite right. Too many joints. Too few fingers. Cal dismissed the thought as superstition. He was a pragmatic man, a man of science and observation. He didn't believe in myths and legends. Yet, the image of those 6-toed prints lingered, refusing to be dismissed. He decided to take one last look. He grabbed a flashlight and headed back out into the storm, determined to find something soon, anything that would explain what he'd seen. The rain had turned the ground into a muddy morass. The tracks were even more pronounced now, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. He focused his attention on the immediate area, searching for other clues, and then he saw it, half buried in the mud, glinting faintly in the flashlight's beam, was a small tarnished object. He knelt, carefully digging it free with his fingers. It was a coin, old, very old, Spanish. Cal turned it over in his hand, wiping away the mud. The metal was almost black with age, the details worn smooth, but he could still make out the faint imprint of a Spanish coat of arms. He didn't recognize the denomination, but he knew enough about the history of the Southwest to know that Spanish coins like this weren't common finds. They were relics of a bygone era, artifacts of a forgotten past. He felt a prickle of unease crawl across his skin. What was a Spanish coin doing here, on his ranch, near a set of impossible tracks? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. As the storm raged on around him, the chipped paint of the ranch gate groaned in protest. As Silas Blackwood pushed it open, his SUV churning up mud, despite the receding storm. Cal Dennison watched him approach, a knot forming in his stomach. Blackwood wasn't a welcome sight. He radiated an energy that felt invasive, like a predator sizing up its prey. Blackwood cut the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the drip of water from the eaves of the house. He emerged, lean and wiry, dressed in expensive weather. His face, tanned and etched with lines, held a disconcerting intensity. His eyes, the color of flint, scanned the ranch with a meticulous thoroughness that made Cal bristle. "Mr. Dennison, I presume?" Blackwood's voice was smooth, almost oily. "Who is asking?" Cal replied, his tone deliberately curt. He didn't offer a handshake. "Silas Blackwood. I'm a historian. Local folklore's my specialty. Been doing some research on the area. Remarkable history, this valley." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Heard you've got yourself a nice spread here. Bar none, is it?" "It is." Cal kept his response clipped, refusing to offer any more information. Blackwood ignored the dismissal. "Beautiful land, but I understand it has seen its share of hardship. Some say it is cursed." He tilted his head, studying Cal with unnerving precision. "You're a private man, Mr. Dennison. Not much on local socials, if the folks in Redemption are to be believed." "I value my privacy," Cal said, his hand unconsciously drifting toward his back, the old habit. "Of course, understandable." Blackwood's lips curved into a tight smile. "I'm particularly interested in the history of this ranch. It has stood for a long time, hasn't it? Owned by a few different families over the years, a few disappearances too, if I remember correctly." The mention of disappearances struck a nerve. Cal had heard the whispers, the local legends about Bar None, stories about ranchers who'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a lingering sense of dread. He dismissed them as folklore, as tall tales spun to entertain tourists. But now, with Blackwood's pointed questions and the unsettling discovery of the tracks, the stories felt different. "This ranch has a long history," Cal acknowledged, carefully neutral. "Like any other ranch in this valley." "Oh, but this one's different, Mr. Dennison. This one is tied to the legend of the lost conquistador gold." Blackwood's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "The tale of Coronado's lost treasure. They say it was never recovered, buried somewhere in these mountains, guarded by something." Cal scoffed. "Old wives' tales." "Are they? I've spent years tracing the Coronado Trail, piecing together fragments of maps, deciphering cryptic clues, and everything keeps leading back here, to Bar None." He paused, leaning closer. "I understand your brother Daniel was also interested in the legend." The name hit Cal like a physical blow. Daniel. Even now, years after his death, the mention of his brother's name twisted a knot of pain in his gut. "What do you know about Daniel?" Callie's voice was dangerously low. Blackwood held up his hands in a gesture of conciliation. "Just what I've heard around town. He was a history professor, right? Specialized in the Spanish Southwest. I believe he spent a considerable amount of time researching the Coronado expedition before his accident." "It wasn't an accident," Cal said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Of course, I'm just repeating what I've been told." Regardless, he clearly believed something was here. "And you, Mr. Dennison, do you believe?" "I believe in hard work and leaving things alone." Blackwood chuckled softly. a pragmatic man. I admire that. But sometimes, the past has a way of catching up with us. Sometimes, the whispers of gold are too tempting to ignore. He handed Cal a card. Think about what I've said. If you ever come across anything unusual, anything that might shed light on the legend, feel free to give me a call. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. I noticed some interesting tracks near the arroyo. Rather peculiar. Did you happen to see them? Cal said nothing, watching Blackwood climb back into his SUV and drive away, a plume of dust rising in his wake. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Blackwood knew too much, or at least he knew enough to be dangerous. He went inside, needing a distraction. Tiberius, sensing his agitation, whined and nudged his hand. "It is all right, boy," Cal murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Just a bad feeling." He brewed a pot of coffee, then found himself drawn to the old trunk in the attic. It contained family heirlooms, photographs, and letters, things he hadn't looked at in years. He opened it, the scent of aged wood and mothballs filling the air. He sifted through the contents, stopping at a small, leather-bound journal. It belonged to his grandfather, Old Man Dennison, the original owner of Bar None. He hadn't known his grandfather well. The man had been an enigma, a gruff, taciturn figure who'd spent most of his time wandering the mountains, prospecting for gold. He began to read, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The journal was filled with rambling entries about the ranch, the weather, and the local law. But then he came across a passage that caught his attention. "The old ones say there is something in the arroyo, something that doesn't like to be disturbed. They say the conquistadors angered it, desecrated a sacred place. That is why the gold was lost, why men disappear. It watches, waits, hidden in the rocks. Tiberius, my old hound, understands. He feels it too, a coldness that settles on the land when it stirs." Cal paused, a chill running down his spine. His grandfather had written this decades ago. He dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man lost in the wilderness. But now, Tiberius, who had followed him to the attic, let out a low growl, staring intently at the far corner of the room. "What is it, boy?" Cal asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight. The dog didn't respond, just continued to growl, his gaze fixed on the shadows. Suddenly a deafening roar erupted from outside. The ground trembled. Cal rushed to the window, just in time to see a wall of water cascading down the arroyo. A flash flood unleashed by the lingering monsoon rains. "Tiberius, get down," he yelled, grabbing the dog and pulling him under the sturdy attic table. The flood waters surged through the ranch, engulfing everything in their path. The sound was overwhelming, a chaotic symphony of rushing water, cracking wood, and roaring debris. When the waters finally receded, leaving behind a trail of mud and destruction, Cal emerged from the attic, his heart pounding in his chest. The ranch was a mess. Fences were down. The barn was partially collapsed, and the landscape had been irrevocably altered. He and Tiberius cautiously surveyed the damage. The arroyo, once a dry wash, was now a churning torrent of mud and debris. The human tracks were gone, erased by the relentless force of the flood. But as he walked along the bank, sifting through the wreckage, something caught his eye, a glint of white amongst the mud and rocks. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat. He reached down and carefully pulled the object free. It was a bone, a fragment of a human bone, small and brittle, tangled in a piece of decaying wood. The rain started again, a soft, mournful drizzle. Cal stared at the bone fragment, a cold dread settling over him. The whispers of gold had suddenly taken on a far more sinister tone, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the piece he'd fought so hard to find was shattered perhaps irrevocably. The Redemption Public Library smelled of dust and forgotten stories. Cal Dennison, feeling conspicuously out of place in his worn jeans and work boots, spent hours poring over microfilms and brittle newspapers. He'd started with articles about Daniel, his brother, searching for any clue about his obsession with the Coronado legend. He found plenty about Daniel's academic work, scholarly articles on Spanish colonial history, but nothing that explained his increasing fixation in the months leading up to his death. Then he branched out, searching for accounts of disappearances in the Bar None area. The library's local history archive yielded a disturbing trove of stories: ranchers vanishing without a trace, livestock slaughtered under peculiar circumstances, unsettling tales of strange lights and sounds emanating from the arroyo. He found one article from 1938 describing the disappearance of a whole family, the Ortegas, who de-owned Bar None before his grandfather. The article reported rumors of a curse and whispers of an ancient evil guarding a lost treasure. One detail stood out. Several accounts mentioned a recurring symbol found near the site of the disappearances, a roughly drawn spiral within a circle, a symbol the Ortega family had reportedly painted on their barn. He copied the image, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. It felt familiar. As he was leaving the library, he spotted Silas Blackwood waiting in his car across the street. Blackwood's gaze locked onto his, a predatory gleam in his flinty eyes. Cal ignored him, walking toward his truck with a deliberate stride. Blackwood waited until he was inside before approaching. Blackwood asked, his voice deceptively casual. "Just researching local history," Cal replied, starting the engine. "Ah, yes, local history, fascinating stuff. I've been doing a little digging myself." I spoke with Old Man Hemlock, the tribal elder from the Mescalero Apache reservation. He had some interesting things to say about this land, about the spirits that dwell here. He spoke of the stone watchers and the hungry earth. Cal's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm not interested in your folklore, aren't you? Or are you afraid of what you might find?" Blackwood leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Look, I know you're holding something back. Your brother was close to a breakthrough. I can feel it. Daniel was a historian. He chased myths, that is all. He knew something, and now you do too. Don't play coy with me, Dennison. I'm prepared to offer a substantial sum for any information you have. About the gold, about your brother, about anything. I'm not selling anything." Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a harsh, uncompromising expression. "That is a mistake. This isn't a game, Dennison. People have died trying to unravel this mystery. You're playing with forces you don't understand." He paused, his eyes boring into Cal's. "Consider this a friendly warning." Cal didn't respond. He shifted into gear and drove off, ignoring Blackwood's intense stare. The encounter had left him shaken, an unsettling premonition settling over him. Blackwood wasn't just a historian. He was something else, driven, ruthless, and dangerous. The drive back to the ranch was punctuated by fragmented images, shards of memory that surfaced without warning. The arid landscape blurred into the swirling dust of a desert battlefield. The stifled screams, the metallic tang of blood, faces young and terrified, dissolving into the heat haze. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting to suppress the flashbacks. He hadn't felt this unmoored in years. The past was breaking through, threatening to consume him. Desperate for the solace of routine. But even the familiar sights, the weathered barn, the grazing cattle, Tiberius waiting patiently by the house, failed to offer comfort. He decided to focus on something practical. The flood had unearthed a lot of debris. He needed to start cleaning up, assessing the damage. He started in Tiberius's old study, a small, cluttered room that had served as his brother's workspace before Daniel's death. Tiberius, as if understanding his purpose, settled at his feet, his head resting on his paws. He began sifting through the piles of books and papers, sorting through Daniel's research materials. He found maps of the region, annotated with strange symbols and cryptic notes. Old Spanish land grants, geological surveys, even hand-drawn sketches of the arroyo. Tucked away in a false bottom of a wooden chest, he found a collection of journals. Not Daniel's academic notebooks, but personal journals, filled with rambling thoughts, half-formed theories, and a growing obsession with the Coronado legend. He began to read, his heart pounding in his chest. Daniel's entries detailed his belief that the lost conquistador gold wasn't just a myth. He believed it was real, hidden somewhere on the Bar None Ranch, and he believed that something or someone was actively guarding it. The later entries were increasingly frantic, filled with paranoia and fear, of strange noises in the night, of a growing sense of dread. He mentioned the spiral symbol, calling it a ward, a protection against something ancient and terrible. He'd even sketched the symbol repeatedly in the margins, alongside a series of numbers and letters. Cal painstakingly copied the symbol and the accompanying code into a notebook, determined to decipher it. He worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of urgency. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed. He kept glancing out the window, scanning the surrounding darkness, and then he saw it, a fleeting shadow on the ridge overlooking the ranch. He grabbed his binoculars, focusing on the spot. The shadow was gone. But he'd seen something, a glimpse of movement, a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. He lowered the binoculars, his heart racing. He wasn't alone. He went back to the journals, his mind racing. He hadn't noticed a specific pair of entries before. They were written in a combination of Spanish and a cipher Daniel named Veritas, and frantic in tone. After an hour, Cal had a breakthrough. The numbers and letters were a coordinate system tied to landmarks on the ranch. He translated the coordinates using a topographic map of Bar None. The numbers pinpointed a location on the eastern edge of the property, in the arroyo, a specific isolated bend in the arroyo, near a cluster of strangely shaped boulders, a place he hadn't paid much attention to before. The coded passage ended with a warning. Beware the serpent's tooth. It watches, it remembers. He stared at the coordinates, a chilling realization dawning. Daniel hadn't just been researching the legend. He'd been actively searching for the treasure. And he'd found something that had cost him his life. The pre-dawn air was crisp and carried the scent of sage and damp earth. Cal Dennison and Silas Blackwood, an unlikely pair bound by a shared obsession, navigated the treacherous terrain of a narrow canyon, following the coordinates gleaned from Daniel's journals. Tiberius, surprisingly agile for his age, loped ahead, occasionally pausing to scan the surroundings. Cal hadn't wanted Blackwood along, but the historian possessed an intimate knowledge of the landscape, gleaned from years of obsessive research. He'd practically memorized the old Spanish land grants and topographical maps. Reluctantly, Cal had accepted his assistance, knowing Blackwood wouldn't be easily dissuaded. According to my calculations, Blackwood said, consulting a GPS device, the entrance should be just around this bend. He was right. Hidden behind a veil of tangled vines and overgrown brush was a narrow cave opening, almost completely obscured from view. It was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Cal drew a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay close," he cautioned. The cave descended steeply, the air growing cold and damp. The scent of mildew and something else, something ancient and earthy, filled their nostrils. As they ventured deeper, Cal noticed signs that they weren't the first to be here recently. Fresh boot prints marred the dusty floor, and a discarded energy bar wrapper lay crumpled near a rock outcrop. "Someone else knows about this place," Cal muttered, his hand hovering near the knife strapped to his thigh. Blackwood's eyes gleamed with excitement. "I told you, Dennison. People have been searching for this for centuries. It seems we're not the only ones. The tunnel opened into a large cavern, its walls shimmering with mineral deposits. In the center stood a crumbling stone altar, adorned with faded carvings, and etched into the altar's surface was the spiral symbol, identical to the one Cal had seen in Daniel's journals and the newspaper clippings. "This is it," Blackwood breathed, his voice filled with awe, "the heart of the legend." "Don't get ahead of yourself," Cal said, his gaze sweeping the cavern. "This could be a dead end." "No, look." Blackwood pointed to a section of the cavern wall, where a series of complex symbols were carved into the stone. "These are astronomical alignments. They correspond to a specific date. The winter solstice. During the solstice, the sunlight shines directly into this cavern, illuminating a hidden passage." Cal followed Blackwood's instructions, carefully examining the carvings. He realized Blackwood was right. The symbols were a celestial map, pointing towards a specific location, and as Blackwood manipulated a hidden lever concealed within the altar, a section of the wall silently slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. A tense silence descended as they entered the passage, the air growing thick with anticipation. It led them down a winding series of tunnels, deeper and deeper into the heart of the mountain. Finally, they reached a large, circular chamber, and here the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy, oppressive, almost suffocating. "This is it," Blackwood whispered, his voice trembling. "The treasure chamber. You really believe this is more than just gold, don't you?" Cal asked, watching Blackwood's face. Blackwood's expression darkened. "Gold is just a byproduct. This isn't about wealth, Dennison. It is about power. Coronado didn't just seek gold. He sought something far more valuable, an artifact, a relic said to grant its possessor immortality." Cal scoffed. "Immortality? You sound like one of your folklore characters. I used to think so too, until I started to understand the nature of this place. This land, it remembers, it protects its secrets, and it punishes those who try to exploit them. The gold is cursed, Dennison. I've seen what it does to people. It consumes them, drives them mad." Before Cal could respond, a gunshot shattered the silence. A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the entrance to the chamber. A hulking man, armed with an assault rifle. "Well, well, well," the man sneered. "Looks like we have company, Blackwood. I should have known you'd lead me here. Meridian Resources doesn't appreciate trespassers." "Reyes," Blackwood spat, his face contorted with anger. "You work for them. They want the land, not the gold." "The land is valuable," Reyes replied, leveling his rifle at Cal. "But the legend adds a certain cachet. Meridian plans to build a resort here, a luxury golf course. They aren't keen on having ancient curses and Indian spirits interfering with their plans. This land isn't yours to sell," Cal said, his voice steely. He knew this situation could escalate quickly. Reyes laughed. "Says the squatter. Now, step aside, old man, before you get hurt." Cal didn't move. He quickly assessed his surroundings, calculating angles, identifying potential cover. The chamber was small, offering limited opportunities for maneuverability, but he remembered his training. He hadn't used those skills in years, but they were still there, buried beneath layers of rust and regret. Without warning, Cal launched himself forward, tackling Reyes to the ground. The rifle clattered across the stone floor. A brutal hand-to-hand struggle ensued, a desperate dance of strength and skill. Cal, relying on muscle memory and instinct, disarmed Reyes and pinned him to the ground. Reyes bucked and thrashed, but Cal maintained his grip, delivering a series of precise blows to incapacitate him. Blackwood, surprisingly agile for a scholar, scrambled for cover behind a large boulder. The cavern erupted in gunfire as Reyes managed to free his sidearm. Bullets ricocheted off the stone walls, sending sparks flying. Cal used the chamber's limited cover to his advantage, utilizing the techniques he'd honed during years of military service. He moved like a ghost, anticipating Reyes's movements, flanking him, drawing his fire, and closing the distance. The fight was swift and brutal. Cal disarmed Reyes again, and using a swift maneuver, knocked him unconscious. "Impressive," Blackwood said, emerging from his hiding place. "I didn't know you had it in you." "There are things about me you don't know," Cal replied, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He secured Reyes, then turned his attention to the chamber. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and dust. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find. He and Blackwood cautiously stepped forward, their flashlights illuminating the chamber, and then they saw it. Empty. The chamber was utterly empty. No chests overflowing with gold, no jeweled artifacts, nothing. Just bare stone walls and a layer of dust that had accumulated over centuries. Blackwood stared in disbelief. "Impossible. It has to be here." Cal scanned the chamber, searching for a hidden compartment, a false wall, anything. But there was nothing. The treasure was gone, except for one thing. On a small pedestal in the center of the chamber lay a single object, a framed photograph, its glass cracked and tarnished. Cal picked it up, carefully wiping away the dust. It was a sepia-toned image of a group of Spanish conquistadors standing in front of a massive rock formation. Coronado himself was in the center, his face stern and resolute. But it wasn't the conquistadors that held Cal's attention. It was the background. The rock formation in the photograph wasn't just any rock formation. It was the very canyon they had just traversed. And behind the conquistadors, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, a haunting, spectral figure. 6 toes were clearly visible on the left foot. The photograph felt cold in Cal Dennison's hand, a brittle link to a past he hadn't known existed. He studied the faces in the image, focusing on the figure in the background. The 6 toes were undeniable. It wasn't a trick of the light or a photographic anomaly. It was a deliberate, unsettling detail. "Who is that?" he asked, turning to Silas Blackwood. Blackwood peered at the photograph, his face pale. "That is old man Tiberius's grandfather Josiah, a local healer, a man deeply connected to the land. He worked as a guide for Coronado, according to the oral histories." Cal frowned. Tiberius's grandfather. What was he doing with Coronado's expedition? Josiah wasn't just a guide. He was a guardian. He knew the true nature of what Coronado was seeking. It wasn't just gold. It was something else, a source of energy, a place of power. The conquistadors wanted to exploit it, to harness its energy for their own purposes. And Josiah tried to stop them. He did. He led them on a wild goose chase, hid the treasure, and then disappeared. The legend says he made a pact with the spirits of the land, trading his life to protect the site. Cal's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information. The spiral symbol, the coded journals, the disappearances, the warnings, all pointed to one conclusion. The treasure wasn't a prize to be won. It was something to be protected. But why go to such lengths to hide it? He asked. Because it is not the gold itself that is valuable. It is what the gold conceals, Blackwood replied, his voice low. There is a source of geothermal energy beneath this land, a reservoir of clean, sustainable power. Meridian Resources doesn't want the gold. They want the mineral rights, the energy source. They've been trying to acquire this land for decades, but the legends, the disappearances, they've always served as a deterrent. So the gold was a distraction. Exactly, a red herring. It was hidden to deter outsiders, to protect the land from exploitation. A wave of anger washed over Cal. Daniel's obsession hadn't been about treasure hunting. He'd been trying to uncover the truth, to protect the ranch from falling into the wrong hands. And Reyes, Cal asked. He was sent by Meridian Resources. Yes, they've been employing aggressive tactics to acquire the land. Intimidation, sabotage, even violence. They knew I was close to finding the treasure, and they sent Reyes to silence me. You let them find you, Cal stated, not as a question. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. I cultivated a relationship with Meridian. I fed them enough information to keep them interested, to divert their attention from the true nature of the site. I needed access to their resources, their data. I was playing a dangerous game. Playing both sides, Cal said, his voice laced with suspicion. It was the only way to protect the land, Blackwood insisted. I knew if Meridian discovered the energy source, they'd destroy everything. They wouldn't care about the history, the legend, the consequences. The sincerity in Blackwood's voice was disarming, but Cal remained cautious. He'd learned long ago not to trust anyone. Just then, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the chamber. They dove for cover as Reyes, having recovered, burst back into the room, his eyes burning with fury. You won't get away with this, he roared, firing wildly. Time to go, Blackwood yelled, scrambling towards the tunnel. Cal knew they couldn't win a prolonged firefight. In the confined space, they had to get out to lead Reyes away from the chamber. He returned fire, suppressing Reyes's advance, then followed Blackwood into the winding tunnels. The chase led them through a labyrinth of dark, winding passages, culminating in a narrow gorge carved by the recent floodwaters. The canyon was a treacherous maze of slick rocks and raging currents. Reyes pursued them relentlessly, firing his weapon with reckless abandon. Bullets whizzed past their heads, chipping away at the canyon walls. Cal used his military training to navigate the treacherous terrain, leading Reyes into a series of carefully calculated ambushes. He utilized the natural cover, the rushing water, and the slippery rocks to his advantage, slowing Reyes down, exhausting him. At one point, Reyes took a tumble into the icy water, losing his rifle. Cal could have finished him then, but he hesitated. Taking a life wasn't something he wanted to do again. He simply continued to move, forcing Reyes to scramble out of the water and resume the chase. Finally, they reached a relatively open area near the canyon's mouth. Cal turned to face Reyes, drawing his knife. It is over, Reyes, he said, his voice cold and resolute. Reyes charged, a desperate glint in his eyes. Cal sidestepped his attack, using his momentum against him, and with a swift, precise movement, disarmed him. He pinned Reyes to the ground, the knife pressed against his throat. Don't move, he warned. Blackwood approached cautiously, his face pale and shaken. He secured Reyes with rope he'd had concealed in his pack. As they caught their breath, Cal's gaze fell on the photograph again. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, faint markings on the back of the image. He carefully peeled back a layer of aged paper, revealing a hidden message written in a delicate script. It was another set of coordinates. What is it? Blackwood asked. Cal read the coordinates aloud. This isn't the only location. There is another spot, a smaller cave, further up the canyon, marked as the Serpent's Eye. A chill ran down his spine. The Serpent's Tooth, the Serpent's Eye. The cryptic warnings from Daniel's journal. They were connected, and then a horrifying thought crossed his mind. Daniel wasn't just researching the legend, Cal murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He was involved in the original hiding. He knew about the energy source, about the true purpose of the treasure. He remembered Daniel's increasingly erratic behavior in the months before his death, the secret phone calls, the late-night trips into the desert. He dismissed it as academic obsession, but now he was being followed. Cal realized his voice filled with dread. Someone who knew what he was up to. Someone wanted to silence him. He clutched the photograph tightly in his hand, a grim determination hardening his gaze. He had to find out what Daniel had discovered. He had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The fate of the ranch, and perhaps his own sanity, depended on it. And he suspected, with a growing sense of foreboding, that the Serpent's Eye held the key to unlocking the canyon's darkest secrets. The ascent to the Serpent's Eye was brutal. The coordinates led them to a crumbling, abandoned mine shaft, clinging precariously to the side of a sheer cliff face. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the darkness, illuminating the skeletal remains of rusted machinery and collapsed timbers. "This place is a death trap," Blackwood said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "It is also the last place anyone would look." Cal replied, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. He scanned the surroundings, his senses on high alert. Something didn't feel right. The silence was too profound, too absolute. They moved cautiously into the mine shaft, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder, heavier, laden with the scent of decay and damp earth. They followed a narrow, winding tunnel, descending deeper into the mountain's belly. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the darkness ahead. "Impressive, Mr. Dennison. You're more resourceful than I anticipated." A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the faint light. Arthur Penhaligon, the CEO of Meridian Resources. A man whose polished exterior concealed a ruthless ambition. He was flanked by two heavily armed security guards. "Penhaligon," Cal said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I should have known you were behind all of this." Penhaligon chuckled. "Sentimentality is a weakness, Mr. Dennison. One your brother unfortunately possessed." He was a stubborn man, obsessed with preserving the past. He refused to see the potential this land held. "You didn't want the gold," Cal stated, his eyes narrowing. "You wanted the energy source beneath the ranch." "Precisely. Decades ago, my grandfather discovered geological anomalies in this area. He realized the potential for geothermal energy, enough to power an entire state. But the legend of the gold, the whispers of a curse, they made it impossible to acquire the land legally. So, we played the long game. We waited for the right opportunity. And you used Reyes to intimidate anyone who stood in your way," Blackwood interjected, his voice trembling with anger. "Reyes was a necessary inconvenience." Penhaligon dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Collateral damage. This ranch is vital to our future. It represents economic progress, innovation. You can't stand in the way of that. You're willing to destroy a piece of history, a natural wonder, for a quick profit?" Cal asked, his voice laced with contempt. "History is written by the victors, Mr. Dennison, and Meridian Resources intends to be the victor." Penhaligon signaled to his guards. "Take him into custody and secure the site." The guards advanced, their weapons drawn. Cal knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. But he wasn't afraid. He'd faced worse odds before. He reacted instinctively, drawing his knife and launching himself towards the closest guard. He moved with a speed and precision born of years of training, disarming the guard with a swift, fluid motion, and using his momentum to send him crashing into the tunnel wall. The second guard opened fire, but Cal was already moving, utilizing the mine shaft's claustrophobic confines to his advantage. He ducked behind a pile of rubble, returning fire with a pistol he always kept concealed beneath his jacket. The mine shaft erupted in chaos. Gunshots echoed off the stone walls, sending sparks flying. Cal used his knowledge of the terrain, the tunnels, the hidden crevices, to outmaneuver his opponents. He moved like a phantom, appearing and disappearing in the darkness, exploiting their lack of familiarity with the labyrinthine network of passages. He led them into a collapsed section of the mine, forcing them to navigate a treacherous maze of debris. He used fragmentation grenades, salvaged from his past, to create diversions, disrupting their advance and forcing them to take cover. Penhaligon, witnessing the unfolding chaos, began to panic. "Kill him, just kill him," he screamed. Cal ignored him, focusing on neutralizing the security guards. He used a combination of tactical maneuvers, hand-to-hand combat, and precise gunfire to disarm and incapacitate them. Finally, he found himself face to face with Penhaligon, alone in the darkness. "It is over, Penhaligon," Cal said, his voice steely. Penhaligon stared at him, his face contorted with rage. "You haven't won, Dennison. Meridian Resources has powerful allies. We won't let this stand." "You underestimate the power of the land," Cal replied. He used his phone to activate a pre-recorded transmission, sending evidence of Penhaligon's illegal activities. The intimidation tactics, the falsified environmental reports, the bribery Cybene to a network of journalists and law enforcement agencies. Penhaligon's face drained of color as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. You've ruined everything. You ruined it yourself," Cal said. Within hours, Meridian Resources' operation was exposed. Federal agents swarmed the ranch, seizing documents and arresting Penhaligon and his associates. The media descended, eager to report on the scandal. The fight was over. Bar none was safe. In the aftermath, Cal sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Tiberius lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. Blackwood was talking to the federal agents, providing further testimony. Cal had considered leaving, moving on, finally escaping the ghosts that haunted him. But as he looked out over the vast landscape, a sense of peace settled over him. This land, this ranch, it wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place to belong. He'd spent years trying to escape his past, but he realized he couldn't run from it. He had to confront it, to learn from it, to use his skills to protect something he believed in. He wouldn't pretend the pain was gone. The memories of his brother, the horrors of his past, would always be with him. But he had found a purpose, a reason to stay. He'd stay and protect Bar None, preserving its history, safeguarding its secrets. He'd become the guardian Josiah once was, a silent protector of the land. He looked out over the desert, a vast and enigmatic landscape that held countless secrets. He knew there were still mysteries hidden beneath the surface, whispers of the past waiting to be uncovered. But for now, he had found a measure of peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch. Cal smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. The desert held its secrets, and he was finally ready to listen.